Morning everyone, welcome back to the channel. So the last video I did, or maybe the last but one, was all about good camera bodies for wildlife photography in end of 2024, 2025. Well, it's now 2025, so on the last video I covered Nikon, Canon and Sony. So on this video, what I want to do is just finish off the whole roundup and we'll look at camera bodies from Olympus, Panasonic and Fuji. And the reason I put these in the second video is for no reason actually, it's just the way it's worked out. So there are some fine camera bodies from all of those camera manufacturers that are going to be great for wildlife photography. So before we get started, I just want to recap on what I said last time. And the two things that are most important, I think, when it comes to, well, there's a number of things when it comes to picking a camera body, but clearly for wildlife photography, and that's what this video is all about, autofocus is an absolute key thing to look at. So we're going to look at the autofocus on all these different camera bodies. Image quality, of course, noise control, frame rate are all important, but autofocus primarily is the most important thing. And then last but not least, thinking about pre-capture or pro-capture is also a really useful option to have, but it's not the be all and end all. So the most important thing is going to be autofocus performance. First up then is the Panasonic G9 Mark II. It's a micro four thirds system camera, which basically means the sensor is smaller than a full frame sensor, about half the size. And that's got pluses and minuses. It means the cameras are really small and the lenses, they're small and light, so very portable. And it also means the systems are generally a bit cheaper than the full frame equivalent. Now there are downsides. You tend to get a bit more noise because all your pixels are scrunched into a smaller sensor, and getting that really soft out of blurred background is a little bit more difficult because you get more depth of field with a micro four thirds camera than you would with the corresponding focal length on a full frame camera. But fact of the matter is, I know loads of people that shoot micro four thirds and they get stunningly good results when it comes to wildlife photography. Now the old G9 was a good camera, the Panasonic G9, but the autofocus system did let itself down. So the G9 Mark II has recently come out a few months ago, and the autofocus system has been massively improved. And I know a couple of people using the Panasonic G9 Mark II and they're getting fantastic results. It's a 25 million pixel camera, so plenty of information being recorded on that sensor. As I say, the autofocus system is fantastic. It's got animal eye detect, and again it works. So that's a massive tick on that box. As I say, image quality is good, autofocus is good, image quality is really good. Obviously I don't think it'll be as good as a full frame equivalent, but it's easily good enough. And I would happily shoot with a micro four thirds if I didn't want to carry the weight of my full frame system around. So that's all great. It's got a really decent frame rate and an excellent electronic viewfinder as well, really bright and really crisp. So all in all, I would say the Panasonic G9 Mark II would be a really good option if you wanted to keep the weight and the size of your kit down and you don't want to spend an absolute ridiculous amount of money. I think new, the body is about £1,650, and this is the top end body. So, you know, the equivalent top end body of a full frame, say Canon or Sony, you're looking at £6,500. So there's a massive difference, and you're still getting unbelievably good technology. So I don't think you should rule out the G9 Mark II. Video's always been good on the Panasonics, and it will shoot 4K 120 slow motion. So again, that's another massive box ticked. So I would say the Panasonic G9 Mark II is an absolute brilliant camera, and definitely worth considering if you want to get into wildlife photography in a big way. Next up is the OM1 Mark II. Again, it's another micro four thirds system camera. And one of the things I would say about both the Panasonic and the Olympus, there's a really good range of lenses for wildlife photographer. It's part of the four thirds system, and it means that you've got lots of options when it comes to wildlife photography, both zoom lenses and prime lenses. So that's something else that's worth taking into consideration. Now the OM1 Mark II is similar to the OM1, which was already a good camera. So it's got a great autofocus system, it's got animal and eye detect, animal eye detect, so that's great. It's going to track those wildlife subjects with no problems at all. It's a 20.4 million pixel camera, so again, a decent amount of image quality there. The Panasonic's got 25 million pixels, so slightly more when it comes to the megapixel count. It's also got pre-capture. So pre-capture is where the camera buffers before images before you hit the shutter button. So basically, if you are doing, let's say, a woodland bird that's taking off, and you hit the shutter button and you're just a bit too late and that bird's already flown out the frame, using pre-capture, what that basically does is it takes a number of pictures before you hit the shutter button and saves it in the buffer. And then as you hit the shutter button, you've already got 20 or 30 pictures before you actually reacted and took the picture. So it means that bird taking off, even if you missed it because your reactions were slightly too slow, you probably got it because those pictures have already been buffered into the internal memory and saved before you hit the shutter button. So it's a really good option for wildlife photography. So the OM1 Mark II has got that. I believe the OM1 had that too. But as we're talking about cameras for 2025, we might as well talk about the latest versions of all these cameras. So that's great. That's great. It's got great autofocus, animal eye tracking, all good, along with loads of other types of tracking as well. It's got pre-capture. It's got a 20 million pixel sensor, which, you know, is I think easily good enough. A great frame rate. It's a fast frame rate for the mechanical shutter, but unbelievably fast on the electronic shutter. Video is good, 4K 60 frames a second, and it'll do up to 240 frames slow motion in full HD, so that's unbelievably slow. And then one of the biggest improvements when it comes to the OM1 Mark II is the autofocus when it comes to video. As soon as you hit slow motion on the OM1, I believe, you were down to manual focus, which when you're trying to track a fast-moving wildlife subject isn't great. So now I believe you've got autofocus on the slow motion mode, certainly up to 120 frames a second. So that's a really good option as well. Image stabilisation is good, along with the G9 Mark II, and I mentioned in my first video about the full when I was looking at Nikon, Sony and Canon, I wasn't going to mention image stabilisation for each different camera because they're all good. So it means you can shoot handheld at much slower shutter speeds, and also I've been able to shoot fairly decent video with long lenses on my Nikon Z9 handheld with the image stabilisation because it is so good. So that's another thing it's worth considering. It's fully weather sealed, so the OM1 Mark II is a great camera for taking out and about and using in sort of hostile environments. So all in all, I think it's a brilliant camera body and certainly worth thinking about if you are interested in wildlife photography. The Olympus OM1 Mark II, again, it's a reasonable price taken in the grand scheme of things. It's about £2,100, which is a lot of money, you know, but it is a top-end body. It's literally the best Olympus body you can buy. And again, if you compare that to the price of a Sony or a Canon top-end, you know, you're looking at, as I say, £6,000, £6,500. So the thing with the Micro Four Thirds is you do get incredibly good value for money. So as I say, as I just mentioned, I think it's definitely worth thinking about. I know so many people that have switched to the OM1 series simply because they're smaller and lighter, and you know, carrying a long lens around is hard work. So with the smaller lenses and the smaller camera bodies, it does mean being out all day becomes a lot more pleasant experience. So don't rule out the Panasonic G9 Mark II, and I wouldn't rule out the OM1 Mark II either, but just be aware that there are certain compromises you make with the smaller sensor. Last but not least is Fujifilm, and they make a number of really good APS-C camera bodies. So that's like a halfway house in between the Micro Four Thirds system and the full frame system. So the Micro Four Thirds system is about half the size, the sensor is about half the size of a full frame sensor, and then the APS-C sensors are about 2/3 of the size of a full frame sensor. So it's almost like quite a nice compromise. You get fairly reasonably sized camera bodies, the lenses are not ridiculously big, but also you get great image quality. Fuji do a number of camera bodies, APS-C censored bodies, and many of those will be good for wildlife photography. Now, a few years ago, I would have absolutely not picked a Fujifilm camera body for wildlife photography because they didn't make any long lenses. So it was a great camera body for landscapes, for architecture, for street. The image quality and the colours on Fujifilm cameras are superb. So, but they didn't make a long lens, so it didn't make sense to think about Fujifilm cameras in terms of a wildlife photography camera. They have fortunately changed that now, and there is I think it's a 150 to 600 or a 200 to 600 millimeter zoom lens, so it means that you've got this long lens option. I mean, personally, I think Fuji wouldn't be on my list of camera bodies to use for wildlife photography because I think the long lens range isn't as extensive as some other camera bodies. But if you own a Fujifilm camera and you want to dabble with wildlife photography, then there's definitely a lens there now for you, which I think is really great, and I think it's sort of well overdue actually. So you can use Fujifilm cameras for wildlife photography because we do need that long lens, don't we? So there's, as I say, a number of bodies. There's a number of 40 million pixel camera bodies, and then there's a number of 26 million pixel camera bodies. So there's camera bodies such as the X-T5, which is a 40 million pixel sensor. And that camera body, along with a lot of the other Fuji camera bodies, has got animal eye detect. I believe some of them have also got pre-capture. So that ticks those boxes for wildlife photography. The high ISO performance is pretty good because it's an APS-C sensor, so not as big as a full frame sensor, but still pretty reasonable. I've used APS-C sensor cameras for wildlife photography for many years in the past, so that works well. I think it's 15 frames a second mechanical and much faster electronic. So when it comes to the frame rate, the image quality, 40 million pixels is a good amount of image quality. So that also will give you the ability to crop because you've got a lot of pixels there on that camera body. So image quality is good. Croppability, if the animal's not quite close enough to the lens, so you know, we like to have the ability to crop as well. That's also good. Frame rate is good. Noise control is fine. It's an APS-C sensor. And there is a wildlife photography lens now. And as I say, it's got animal eye detect, which is one of those key autofocus options that we need for wildlife photography. So any of the Fuji cameras that has got pre-capture, animal eye detect, is going to make a fine body for wildlife photography. Would I choose it? I don't think I would personally, because I want a little bit more variety when it comes to long lenses. But as I say, you've got this long zoom lens now for Fuji cameras, so it means you can use it for wildlife photography. So yeah, it's all good really. Now, when it comes to the 26 million pixel sensors, there's quite a few actually. Now, there's the Fuji XS20, which is actually just come down in price, and you can pick up for around about £1,000. It's not the best specified, but it does have animal eye detect. So that means, you know, autofocus wise, it's going to be fine. It will take the same zoom lens that will fit all the Fujis, so that's also good. You've got your long lens option. It's a 26 million pixel sensor, so it's going to be reasonably good with noise control because the APS-C sensor is bigger than the Micro Four Thirds sensor, and 26 million pixels on that sensor should give you good noise control. So all of those things, it ticks the boxes. And it's got a mechanical shutter frame rate, I think, of about, it's not quite as good as some of the other models, so it's about 10 frames a second. But again, 10 frames a second is enough. I shot for years using 10 frames a second. I've now got 20 frames a second on my Nikon Z8, but 10 frames is enough, I believe. So I don't think you need these sort of mega 120 frames a second. That leaves you with so many pictures to sort through at the end of a shoot. So yeah, I think the image quality is fine, the frame rate's fine, the autofocus is good. There's a lens you can use for wildlife photography, and it's a reasonably priced camera body. Is it the best Fuji for wildlife photography? No, it's not the best, but it's got everything you need. So if you were starting at a lower budget, less than £1,000 is probably not a bad option. The Fuji SX20 actually is 8 frames per second mechanical, although the electronic shutter will have a faster frame rate, but it's not a stack sensor. So I mentioned on my previous video, the reason stack sensors are good is because the information is recorded and transferred really quickly. So it means with a stack sensor, you get less chance of something called rolling shutter. And what rolling shutter is when you're using the electronic shutter, not the mechanical shutter. If you get a rolling shutter, it means that straight lines or anything that's moving quickly, especially if it's a straight-ish line, can get distorted. So if you've got a fast-moving bird, although the wings are not a straight line, those wings can get distorted if you get some rolling shutter, or the beak could get a bit distorted. So you have to be careful when you use the electronic shutter when the sensor isn't stacked. And with this camera, it hasn't got a stack sensor. So you'd be more sensible, if it's a very fast moving subject, to stick to the mechanical shutter and sticking with 8 frames a second, which is still okay. Last but not least, when it comes to the Fuji cameras I want to talk about today is the Fuji XH2S. Now this is another 26 million pixel sensor, but it's a whole quicker camera body entirely. It's got a stack sensor. Now, I think I mentioned on my previous video when we talked about the Fuji, the Nikons, the Canons and the Sonys, the beauty of a stack sensor, it makes everything quicker. So the information gets recorded quicker, it gets transferred quicker, everything works more quickly. And the important thing about this is when you're using the electronic shutter, it means you avoid something called rolling shutter. And then what rolling shutter is, it basically means when you've got a fast moving subject, you can get distortion. Like a bird's wing can get distorted into a funny shape, or the beak or the legs. And that's what rolling shutter is. It's because the information isn't being taken off the sensor quick enough. But with a stack sensor, it's much quicker and you don't get rolling shutter. So when you're using the electronic shutter, not the mechanical shutter on a camera, having a stack sensor is really good because we get less distortion. And that means this Fuji, because it's got a stack sensor, is altogether quicker. It means the electronic shutter is quicker than the previous Fuji we talked about, and so is the mechanical shutter, incidentally. The mechanical shutter is 15 frames a second, and the electronic shutter is 40 frames a second. So for that fast-moving wildlife, that's a really good option. It's also got animal eye detect, really good autofocus system. You can use the Fuji long lens, so that's good. It's a 26 million pixel sensor, so again that's good fine detail on a reasonable size sensor. So all of those options are good. So I think this would be a good option if you're a Fuji user, if you're doing fast-paced action, wildlife or sports indeed, because of that stack sensor and the way the whole machine works more quickly. The video is good. It's got 4K 120, so that's easily good enough for, I mean, I'll never shoot more than 120 slow motion, so when I'm shooting wildlife, so that's great. So yeah, I think this particular camera body would be a good option if you're a Fuji user and you want to do wildlife, fast-paced wildlife action. And noise control will be fine as well. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video. Now these are only my personal views. I'm a photography teacher, so I do have a lot of these cameras in my hands, so I get first-hand knowledge with a lot of these cameras. But the fact of the matter is, it's just what I think. I'm not sponsored by anyone, I don't get paid by anyone, but it doesn't mean to say that I get everything is 100% right. You need to do your own research as well when it comes to buying a camera body, because it's a big purchase, isn't it? So I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have enjoyed it, as always, if you give it a thumbs up, a like, that would really help my channel. And if you haven't already subscribed, if you could consider subscribing, that would be great. The more the merrier. And if there's any cameras I've missed out that you're using for wildlife photography, and you want to let me know, just drop that in the comments section below. It's always great for me to hear what you're all doing. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll speak to you on my next video. Bye for now, guys.